Well, Martin, let me introduce you very briefly. As a former president of the Royal Society, Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, Astronomer Royal, member of the Order of Merit, now in the House of Lords, I don't need to say any more. I think everyone knows you. So Martin, it's with great pleasure that I invite you to tell us how we shall be in 2050. Yes. Over to you.
Well, Terry, thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks everyone for logging in to hear this talk. And greetings from Cambridge. Well, let me try and share my screen first and see what I can get. Right. Okay, good. Well, because I've got the title Astronomer Royal, people think I give the Queen her horoscopes. But of course I don't. I've never been asked, and I'm an astronomer, not an astrologer. And I should say at the start that although I'm going to talk about the future, scientists in general are rotten forecasters, although not quite as bad as economists. But what I'm going to do is give some tentative forecasts. And they're based on a recent book of mine shown here. And the theme of the book is "This century is special." It's the first when one species, ours, has the planet's future in its hands. We're deep in the Anthropocene. But let's focus first on two things we can predict, even with a cloudy crystal ball. First, the world in 2050 will be more crowded. The population 50 years ago was below 4 billion. It's now nearly 7.8 billion. And the growth in the last 30 years is indicated by this distorted map, which shows each country by the size of the increase in population in 30 years, and that the increase has been mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and in India and Southeast Asia. What that slide shows is the difference between the age distribution in Africa and the Western country, and the population now is 7.8 billion, but even though the birth rate isn't going up, the population will rise to 9 billion. And the reason for that is that on the left, the young people in Africa and countries like that, they will live longer and they will have children of their own. So that's why we expect 9 billion people by mid-century. And despite doom-laden forecasts in the 1960s, food productions kept pace with rising population. We still have famines, but they're due to conflict or maldistribution, not overall scarcity. But to feed 9 billion by mid-century will require improved agriculture, low-till, water conserving, and GM crops, and maybe some dietary innovations, converting insects, highly nutritious, into palatable food, and making artificial meat. To quote Gandhi, enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Next slide, please, which shows population projections. Is that right?
Yes, we see a challenge, global population predictions.
Yes, okay, that's fine, yes. So these are projections after 2050, and they are pretty uncertain. The key question really is, will the demographic transition towards a low birth rate happen in places like sub-Saharan Africa? Because if it doesn't, then the population of sub-Saharan Africa will go on increasing and will double again between 2050 and 2100, from 2 billion to 4 billion. And that will make the world's population by 2100 something like 11 billion. And I think we agree this would be a really serious situation for the world, because then Africa would be more likely to be trapped in poverty, lagging behind the rest. And of course, the one thing they do have in Africa is the internet, so they know what they're missing, and they will therefore be deeply embittered, mass migration, all the rest. And so wealthy nations, especially those in Europe, I think urgently need to instigate a sort of mega Marshall Plan for Africa, and not just for altruistic reasons. Next slide, please. And another thing, if humanity's collective impact on land use and climate pushes too hard, then there'd be a sort of ecological shock, which could be the cause of mass extinctions. We're destroying the book of life before we've read it. And already there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows, and domestic animals is 20 times more than in wild mammals. Next slide, please. Biodiversity is crucial for human well-being, but preserving the richness of our biosphere has a sort of intrinsic value over and above what it means to us humans. And to quote the great Harvard ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. So the world's getting more crowded. Next slide. And the second firm prediction, it'll get warmer. In contrast to population issues, climate change is certainly not under discussed, though it is underacted upon. The next slide, I think, shows the famous Keeling curve of rising CO2 measured in Hawaii. It's going up, and the oscillations with an annual period are because there are more trees in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere. So in the autumn in the north, the leaves fall off the trees, CO2 goes up and down again. But the long-term trend upwards is, of course, rising greenhouse effect due to more carbon dioxide. Next slide, please, which I think shows some graphs, some projections of what the climate will do in the rest of the century if we have different assumptions about the future rate of burning of fossil fuels. It's still unclear how much the climatic effects of CO2 itself are amplified by associated changes in water vapor, etc. And the vertical bars on the right-hand side of the slide, they indicate the uncertainty. But the important message is that if we continue with business as usual, then we can't rule out, although we can't be sure, later this century, really catastrophic warming, tipping points triggering long-term trends like the melting of Greenland's ice cap. So we're like the proverbial boiling frog, contented in a warming tank until it's too late to save ourselves. And of course, it's nations far away from ours, like Africa, which will suffer most from climate change. Unsurprisingly, it's the young who expect to live to the end of a century whose clamour for action on climate is loudest. Their leverage on voters and the media is amplified by charismatic individuals, especially the disparate quartet of Pope Francis, David Attenborough, Bill Gates, and Greta Thunberg. They have collectively raised this topic on the agenda so that politicians are starting to feel that they can respond to the pressures to deal with climate change without losing votes. But next slide, please. To insert a bit of good cheer, there's a win-win roadmap to a low-carbon future. Nations like Britain and France should accelerate R&D into all forms of low-carbon energy generation and into other technologies where we need parallel progress, better batteries, storage of other kinds, and large-scale grids. This should enable Europe and North America, and next slide please, to reach net zero. But there's something even more important. The faster these clean technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall, so that they become affordable not just to us, but to the global south. And those nations can't reach acceptable living standards without their per capita energy consumption rising, whereas we don't need ours to rise. And they will, moreover, collectively harbour 1 billion more people in 2050 than they do now. So, as it were, bending the trajectory of CO2 emissions from those countries is crucial, and helping them to leapfrog directly to clean energy without building coal-fired power stations, just as they've leapfrogged directly to smartphones and never had landlines. It'll be hard to think, in fact, of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than devising clean and economical energy systems which can achieve net zero for the world. We should be evangelists for new technology, but without it, the world can't provide food nor sustainable energy for an expanding and more demanding population. But many of us have worries about technology. That it's advancing so fast that we may not properly cope with it, and that we'll have a bumpy ride through this century. Next slide. Is that a picture of the Earth?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. A nuclear war looms over us, of course, as a threat. And the only consolation is that there are about 5 times fewer nuclear weapons and on lower alert than there were during the Cold War. But there are now 9 nuclear powers, and probably a bigger chance than ever that smaller nuclear arsenals might be used regionally, or even by terrorists. And some claim, incidentally, that the command and control systems are getting more vulnerable to cyber threats. Moreover, we can't rule out later in the century a standoff between new superpowers handled less well or less luckily than the Cold War and the Cuba crisis were. Nuclear weapons are 20th century technology, but this century has brought surges in new technologies, bio, cyber, and AI. So, next slide. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics offer prospects of containing natural pandemics. But this same research raises, and this is my #1 fear, prospects of engineered pandemics. Next slide. Is that the virus, the influenza virus? And nearly 10 years ago, research groups in Wisconsin and in Holland showed it was surprisingly easy to make this virus more virulent and more transmissible. These so-called gain-of-function experiments can be done in principle for coronavirus. And also the new CRISPR-Cas9 techniques for gene editing, they're hugely promising, but they raise ethical concerns about experiments on human embryos. Next slide. And worries about possible runaway consequences of so-called gene drive, programs to wipe out species. Maybe a mosquito, which you can make sterile so it doesn't spread the Zika virus, for instance, or in this country, the grey squirrels, which are regarded as a pest. Regulation of biotech is needed, but I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed on prudential or ethical grounds can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws can. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that really is a nightmare, because whereas an atom bomb can't be built without large special purpose facilities, biotech involves small-scale dual-use equipment, which is far harder to monitor and verify compliance with. And the rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups or even individuals by biotech and by cyber tech as well will, I think, pose a really intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between freedom and privacy and security. The global village will have its village idiots, but their idiocies can now cascade globally. These concerns are fairly near term. I think within the next 10 or 15 years, they'll rise up the agenda. But what about looking at technology further ahead? On the bio front, you might expect 2 things. First, a better understanding of the combination of genes that determine key human characteristics and the ability to synthesize genomes that match those features. if it becomes possible for biohackers to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, then our ecology and even our species may not long survive unscathed. Next slide, please. And what about another transformative technology? Robotics and AI. DeepMind's AlphaGo Zero computer famously beats human champions in the games of Go and chess. It was given just the rules and was trained by playing literally millions of games in just a day. And next slide, I think, shows a Chinese gentleman, is that right? That's the human challenger who still has some advantages. He lost the game of Go, but whereas the computer uses hundreds of kilowatts of power, he uses about 30 watts, about as much as a light bulb. And he can do lots of things apart from just playing a game. Next slide, it should be a graph showing the speed of computers rising. Is that right?
Yes, evolution of computer power to cost.
Right, very good. And already AI, because of its ever rising processing speed, can cope better than humans with complex, fast changing networks. Traffic flow or electric grids, for instance. And in fact, the Chinese could have an efficient planned economy that Marx could only dream of. And it can help science too. Things like protein folding can be calculated by machines, drug development, and perhaps a machine can do the math and settle whether the string theory really describes our universe. But the implications of AI for society are already ambivalent. If we're sentenced to a term in prison, recommended for surgery, or even given a poor credit rating, we'd expect the reasons to be accessible to us and contestable by us. But if these decisions are entirely delegated to an algorithm, we'd be entitled to feel uneasy, even if given evidence that on average, the machines make better decisions than the humans they've usurped. And AI systems will become more intrusive and more pervasive. All our financial transactions will be in the cloud, managed by a multinational quasi-monopoly. The data may be used for benign reasons, for health and medical research, for instance, but its availability to internet company is already shifting the balance of power from governments to globe-spanning conglomerates. The incipient shift in the nature of work have been addressed in several excellent books by economists and social scientists. I won't say much about that, but clearly machines will take over much of manufacturing and retail distribution. And they can supplement, if not replace, many white-collar jobs, routine legal work, accountancy, computer coding, medical diagnostics, even surgery. In contrast, some skilled service sector jobs like plumbing and gardening require non-routine interactions with the external world, and they'd be among the hardest jobs to automate and hand over to robots. Well, to create a humane society, I think governments will need to vastly enhance the number and status of those who care for the old, the young, and the sick, where we need people with real humanity. There are far too few people doing this. They're poorly paid, poorly esteemed, and insecure in their positions. And if those who are displaced from Amazon warehouses and call centers can be given new jobs as carers, then that's win-win. But that, of course, does involve taxing at a higher level the big companies who own the robots and the AI. And there'll be other privacy concerns. Are you happy if a random stranger sitting near you in a restaurant can, via facial recognition, identify you and invade your privacy? Or if fake videos become so convincing that visual evidence can no longer be trusted? These are short-term concerns. And the arms race between cyber criminals and those trying to defend against them will become still more expensive and vexatious. It's, of course, the speed of the computers which allows them to learn on big training sets. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images, not the way babies learn. They learn to translate by reading millions of pages of multilingual text. In Europe, they're given EU documents. Their boredom threshold is infinite. But acquiring common sense won't be so easy for them, because that involves observing real people in real homes and workplaces. And a machine will be sensorily deprived by the slowness of real life. It's like us watching trees grow. And it won't be able to learn very much by watching real human beings. And robots are still clumsier than a child in moving around pieces on a real chessboard. They can't jump from tree to tree like a squirrel, but sensor technology is advancing at a pace. But let's look still further ahead. What if a machine develops a mind of its own? Would it stay docile or go rogue? Futuristic books portray a dark side where AI gets out of its box, infiltrates the Internet of Things, and pursues goals misaligned with human interests. Next slide, please. Some AI pundits take this seriously, but others, like Rodney Brooks, inventor of the Baxter robot, regard these concerns as premature and think it'll be a long time before artificial intelligence need worry us more than real stupidity does. But be it as it may, it's likely that society will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on whether they'll be idiot savants or display superhuman capabilities. So there we just don't know. Next slide. This shows, I think, Mr. Ray Kurzweil. He's a visionary futurologist who works for Google, and he argues that once machines have surpassed human capabilities, they will themselves design and assemble a new generation of even more powerful ones. In his book, called The Age of Spiritual Machines, he predicts that humans will transcend biology by merging with computers. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they will go over to the other side. Because I was worried that this nirvana may not happen in his lifetime, so he wants to be preserved, frozen in liquid nitrogen until it's reached. And there's a company in Arizona that will freeze you and store your body, so that when immortality is on offer, you could be resurrected or your brain downloaded. I was surprised to find, incidentally, that 3 academics here in England had gone in for this cryonics. 2 had paid the full whack, the third the cut price for just having his head frozen. And I was glad they were from Oxford and not from Cambridge, because I told them I'd rather end my days in an English churchyard than an American refrigerator. But of course, research on aging, which Kurzweil wants, is being seriously prioritized. But will the benefits be incremental, or is aging a disease that can be cured? Dramatic life extension would clearly be a real wild card in population projections. But it may happen along with human enhancement in other forms. Next slide. It's surely on the cards that human beings, their mentality and their physique, may become malleable through the deployment of genetic modification and cyborg techniques. Designer babies will become conceivable in both senses of that word. Moreover, the future evolution, which will be a kind of intelligent design of a secular kind, will take only centuries, far faster than the thousands of centuries needed for Darwinian evolution of a new species. And this is a game changer. When we admire the literature and artifacts that have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity across a time gulf of thousands of years with those ancient artists and their civilizations. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have some algorithmic understanding of how we behaved. Next slide, please. Now I turn to another technology, space. It's beyond our Earth, in environments hostile to humans, that cyborg and AI technology will have the most spectacular scope and where these changes will happen fastest and should worry us less. Next slide. Is a picture of the planets, is that right?
Yes, planets.
Good, yes. Well, during the century, the whole solar system will be explored by swarms of miniaturized probes, far more advanced than what's on the next slide, which is the Cassini probe, which spent 13 years exploring Saturn and its moons, or the New Horizon probe, which transmitted amazing pictures back from Pluto on the next slide, which is 12,000 times further away than the moon. The next step would be the deployment in space of robotic fabricators, which can build large structures, for instance, giant telescopes or solar energy collectors assembled under zero gravity. But what about human spaceflight? The practical case gets weaker, actually, for every advance in robots and miniaturization. So will it have a resurgence? The next picture is a photo which I cherish, which was signed by 7 of the Apollo astronauts a few years ago. And the next slide shows the 2 last men on the moon, Schmidt and Kernan. It's 50 years since they returned. And since that time, hundreds of people have been in low Earth orbit, many in the International Space Station. Next slide. But no one has been back to the moon. It's ancient history to all young people. And there's nothing very glamorous about the space station. It only makes news when something goes wrong, when a toilet fails, or when the astronauts perform stunts like the Canadian Chris Hadfield, who played his guitar and sang David Bowie songs up in the space station. So will there be any inspirational space projects involving humans in future? Next slide shows the latest robot on Mars called Perseverance. There's no denying that this will miss startling discoveries that no human geologist could overlook. But machine learning is advancing fast, as is sensor technology. In contrast, the gap between human and robotic missions in terms of cost remains huge. And NASA's manned program in the last 50 years has been impeded by public and political pressure to be very risk averse. The shuttle was launched 135 times. It crashed twice, less than 2% failure rate. Each of those was a trauma in the US, whereas many adventurers and test pilots will be happy to accept odds like that. And so, next slide, please. Because of this safety culture, NASA will confront political obstacles in achieving any grand goal within a reasonable budget. And in fact, were I an American, I would strongly support NASA's robotic program, but I'd argue that all human missions should be private enterprise ventures done by SpaceX or Blue Origin, the companies run by Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. They can operate a cost-price program far riskier than Western nations could impose on publicly supported civilians. And they get many volunteers, some perhaps even accepting one-way tickets to the moon or to Mars, driven by the same motives as early explorers and mountaineers and the like. The phrase space tourism should be avoided because that lulls people into believing that such events are routine. If that's a perception, the first crashes will be as traumatic as those of the space shuttle were. They must be sold as dangerous sports or intrepid exploration. But I think that by, next slide please, this is a Martian, I think. By 2100, some courageous thrill seekers may have established bases independent from Earth on the Mars, or maybe on asteroids. In fact, Elon Musk, who's I think nearly 50 himself, he says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And he might actually make that, say, in 40 years' time. But don't ever expect mass emigration from Earth. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. And here I disagree with Musk and my late colleague Stephen Hawking. It's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from the Earth's problems. Dealing with climate change on Earth is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. Nonetheless, we should cheer on these brave space adventurers because they will have a pivotal role in spearheading a post-human future in the 22nd century and beyond. And this is why. They'll be ill-adapted to their new habitat on Mars. So they'll have a more compelling incentive than we do on Earth to redesign themselves. And they'll harness the super powerful genetic and cyber technologies that we'll have by the end of the century. These techniques will, one hopes, be regulated here on Earth, but they'll be far beyond the clutches of the regulators. So we should surely wish these Martian pioneers good luck in modifying their progeny to adapt to alien environments. And they may, within a few hundred years, become a new species, a post-human era of the kind that Kurzweil envisages. And I think they will perhaps be the entities that will go beyond our solar system, because if they're near immortal, they're not daunted by a very long voyage. I'm often asked, do astronomers bring a special perspective to global issues? Let me explain why I think they do. The next slide, please, I think shows a time chart. A time chart of evolution on the Earth, depicting that we in our biosphere are the outcome of about 4 billion years of Darwinian evolution. But many people who are happy with that idea somehow think that we humans are the culmination, the top of the tree. But no astronomer can believe that. That's because we know that the sun is less than halfway through its life. It's got 6 billion years before it flares up and dies. And the cosmos may have an infinite future ahead. To quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So we may be nearer the beginning than the end of the emergence of complexity in the cosmos, with attributes that brains can't conceive. Just a quick digression. Next slide, please. The question that astronomers are most often asked is there life out there already? Or is the galaxy waiting for our progeny? Well, we all agree we don't know. Actually, some people don't agree, because I get letters from people who say they've met the aliens, they've been abducted by the aliens, etc. I express skepticism. I say, if the aliens have made the huge effort to traverse interstellar space, would they just make a corn circle, meet one or two well-known cranks, and go away again? And I tell these people to write to each other and not to me. But we know that it's a fascinating question. Is there life elsewhere? We also know, I think, that there's nowhere in our solar system which harbors advanced life. There could be some simple life. There could be freeze-dried bacteria on Mars, on the next slide. There may be creatures swimming under the ice on Saturn's moon Enceladus. Next slide. But let's widen our horizons to the realm of the stars. Next slide. We've learnt that most of these are orbited by residues of planets, just like the sun is. So the galaxy harbors literally billions of habitable planets. And the special interest in some possible twins of our Earth. Planets like the Earth on orbits with temperatures where water can exist. And there are many millions of those in the Milky Way. There's even one orbiting the nearest star, Proxima Centauri. But habitable doesn't mean inhabited. But that's the number one question. But that's a topic for a separate lecture, or maybe the question period, looking for life in other parts of the universe. But next slide, please. Here's another time chart. Oh, is that a nebula? If you go and you find another time.
The past and future of life on Earth.
Right, yes, okay, that's what I want, yes. This shows that life has a very long future as well as a very long past. But my concluding remark really is that even in the context of this concertina time span, stretching billions of years into the future, as it did billions of years into the past, this century is special. It's the first when one species, ours, has the planet's future in its hands. Our creative intelligence could jumpstart the transition from an Earth-based to a spacefaring species and from biological to electronic life. Transitions which could inaugurate billions of years of post-human evolution, even more marvelous than what led to us. On the other hand, in this century, humans could trigger bio, cyber, or environmental catastrophes which foreclose all these potentialities. So what should be our message to the younger generation? Next slide, please. It's surely that there's no scientific impediment to achieving a sustainable world where all enjoy a lifestyle better than those in the West do today. We live under the shadow of new hazards, which I've spoken about in this talk. But these can be minimized by a culture of responsible innovation, especially in fields like biotech, advanced AI, and geoengineering. We've got to do our best to ensure we can harness the benefits and minimize the downsides, and indeed to reprioritize the thrust of the world's technological effort. So we can be, in a sense, technological optimists. But the intractable politics and sociology does engender pessimism, because the scenarios I've described, environmental degradation, unchecked climate change, and unintended consequences of advanced technologies, could trigger serious, even catastrophic setbacks to our society. And our world is so interconnected now that, unlike in previous centuries, a collapse, whether it's societal or ecological, would be a truly global setback. So we're more vulnerable. We saw that to some extent from COVID-19. And given the stakes, these threats to the world need more attention. They shouldn't be ignored. We should be mindful of a maxim due to Nate Silver: the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. And scientists and universities have an obligation to promote beneficial applications of their work, but also to warn against the downsides. Universities should offer their staff's expertise and their convening power to assess which scary scenarios, echo threats, or risk for misapplied technology can be dismissed as science fiction, and how best to avoid the credible ones. And we in Cambridge, incidentally, have set up a centre to address just these issues. It's been going 10 years, and it's now got between 20 and 25 people focusing on extreme threats. And COVID-19 has been a wake-up call, and that's made it more seriously taken by governments and others, because these extreme threats are understudied compared to small and more routine uncertainties. Also, most of the challenges which we need to worry about are global. Coping with COVID-19 plainly is. And the threats of potential shortages of food, water, and natural resources, and of course transitioning to low carbon energy, can't be solved by each nation separately. Nor can the regulation of potentially threatening innovations, especially those spearheaded by globe-spanning commercial conglomerates. Indeed, a key issue is whether, in a new world order, nations need to give up more sovereignty to new organizations along the lines of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, etc., to deal with energy and other concerns. I want to end with a flashback. The next slide, please, which I hope shows Ely Cathedral. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes, okay. Which, of course, many of you here today may have visited. I want to end with a flashback right back to the Middle Ages. Because for medieval people, those who built this cathedral, the entire cosmology, from creation to apocalypse, spanned only a few thousand years. And they knew of nothing beyond Europe. For many, the fens were their world. They were bewildered and helpless in the face of floods and pestilences, and prone to irrational dread. Large parts of the earth were terra incognita. But they built cathedrals like this one. They wouldn't live to see them finished. Vast and glorious buildings, which still inspire us nearly 1,000 years later. Well, our horizons, in space and in time, are now vastly extended, as are our resources and knowledge. But we don't plan centuries ahead. And this seems a paradox. But there is actually a reason. Medieval lives played out against a backdrop which changed little from one generation to the next. So they were confident they would have grandchildren who would appreciate the finished cathedral, even if the masons who built it wouldn't. But for us, unlike for them, the next 100 years, even the next 50 years, will be drastically different from the present. So different that we can't foresee it clearly, and it's harder to plan for it. There's this huge disjunction now between the ever-shortening timescales of social and technical change and the billion-year timespans of biology, geology, and cosmology. So we have to think of spaceship Earth hurtling through the void. Its patches are anxious and fractious, their life support systems vulnerable to disruption and breakdown. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning. The next slide again shows the Earth, reminds us that we need to think globally, we need to think rationally, we need to think long term. This pale blue dot in the cosmos, our Earth, is a special place, and we may be its stewards at a especially crucial time. And we need to be, as it were, good ancestors, empowered by 21st century technology and guided by values which science can't provide, in order that we do leave a world that is safe and habitable for our descendants. So let me stop there. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, Martin. That was both fascinating and challenging. Before I open to other people the discussion, let me make one comment. I think one of the things that might save the human mind in the face of artificial intelligence is something you mentioned, common sense. I do not see how one can define common sense. It's like you recognize it when you see it, but you can't define it.
Yes. I'm trying to get back to where I can see you and you can see me.
I can see the top of your head.
Ah.
I can see you now. That's better.
Yes. You can see me. Okay, that's all right. Yes, good. Yeah. Good. Okay, well, and I completely agree. And that's the thing that computers can't learn at all, and judgment and ethics, etc. And that's a big problem. And that's why I think we've got to be cautious about handing over too much to them.
Indeed. So, Tony, would you like now to deal with the questions?
There is one series of questions from Peter Vizard on the chat function. So Peter would like to try unmuting and asking his question or questions.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
It was really fascinating, and I just read my question because it occurred to me during your talk, and it was very, very illuminating. And I have another question concerning common sense, which has been debunked for quite a long time, and I don't know if you have a thought about that. But the one thing that I did wonder was, what do you mean by a post-human future? And was I not listening? And the other one was you mentioned Hawking, and his basic one of his big fears was that AI would be the single biggest threat to humanity. Do you agree? And do you know why he thought that?
Well, I mean, many people think that, and I should say that Hawking was not in any sense an expert on that topic, but he certainly worried. And of course, there are scenarios where the world economic system is somehow automated, and there's a machine which understands how the system works, and then starts interacting with the Internet of Things and actually changing the world. And this is a scenario that people like Max Tegmark and others talk about. So I think that's what he was concerned about. But I think we do need to worry. But when I mentioned posthumans, it was I did really mean new species, because there's more time lying ahead than the 4 billion years during which we've evolved from protozoa. And I don't think humans are going to be around unchanged for that length of time. Moreover, I think that different species will evolve faster than Darwinian selection, because they could be designed. I mean, if we can redesign the human genome, or if indeed eventually intelligences get downloaded into some electronic form, then of course they will design improved ones, etc. So this is what Kurzweil says, and in the long run, what he says may be true. And so I think we can't assume that humans unchanged will be around for the next 1,000,000 years, or even the next 10,000 years, without having changed into something which we might call a different species. But I think, as I said, the changes will happen fastest if they're triggered by the few people who've gone to live on Mars or somewhere like that, because they've got every incentive and no inhibitions to change. And I think we should try and slow things down and keep the Earth as a sort of garden. We can perhaps, as Jeff Bezos says, have some heavy industry in space, but we should try and regulate the changes in humans. But I think that the post-human era really is the enormous span of time in which our remote progeny are going to exist, and are almost certainly going to be entities that we just can't conceive, because they may have brains that can understand the world in a quite different way from us. We're not the combination.
Thank you.
That answers your question. But...
Well, that's some of the questions. There are lots of other people who want to ask questions, so I'll leave them. Thanks.
Thank you. And those who are pointing out that they've raised their hands, yes, I am aware of it. I wasn't going to interrupt the question in progress. So the first hand to be raised was Nicolas. If you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for the outstanding talk. Really interesting. I had a question around how ethical it is to go to Mars, and assuming there is no life there. If you consider that on one of your great charts, life appeared on Earth very shortly after the first rocks were found. The likelihood of the same scenario happening on Mars and some life managing to survive deep inside the surface is an option. We are going there like there was no risk to those life, but maybe as human being, we are really a walking ecosystem of bacteria who may be ending a lot of life by just dying on that planet and let it be. Should we be concerned about what we could do to that ecosystem if it exists?
Well, I think that's a very important point, and so let me expand a bit on this whole question of extraterrestrial life. One point which people don't appreciate is we don't understand how life began on Earth. We understand Darwinian evolution from the first simple creatures to our biosphere, of which we're a part, but we don't understand the transition from complex chemistry to the first metabolizing, reproducing entities that we'll call alive. This is still a mystery. We don't understand. And therefore, we don't know whether it was some very rare fluke or whether it was something which would have happened in other environments. And of course, we don't know what the environment was where the Earth evolved. They say something was an ocean vent, something it was in a warm pond, etc. So we don't know. But of course, when we have the probe going around the surface of Mars, then of course we've got to make sure it doesn't contaminate Mars, so that any sample it brings back will be pristine Martian material, and we can analyze whether that contains any evidence of simple life. And other possible locations of life in our solar system are under the ice of Europa, a moon of Jupiter, or Enceladus, a moon of Saturn. And there will be probes going there to look for life. And again, as you say, if there is any life there, we should avoid contaminating it there. But of course, if we ask where could there be interesting life or even intelligent life, the fact that we now know that there are millions of Earth-like planets orbiting other stars means there are lots of candidate locations for life. So if the emergence of life isn't a rare fluke, it will exist in lots and lots of places in our galaxy.
Martin, your sound has cracked up, I'm afraid.
Our solar system, then it can't be all that rare.
We've lost you, Martin. Rather, you're still there, but there's no image and no sound.
No sound, no image.
Extremely large telescope, which is 39 meter across, which has a huge mirror, and that'll be able to analyze the light from planets like the Earth orbiting nearby stars to see if there's evidence for oxygen or chlorophyll indicating forests, etc., that sort of thing. We'll be able to answer that question within 10 years from these very big telescopes. And of course, what people then ask is, what about intelligent life, intelligent aliens? Again, it's so fascinating, it's worth looking by all astronomical techniques for something which is manifestly artificial, some transmission or some artifacts. So we should keep our eyes open for that, old techniques, but we don't know what to expect, and it may be something we wouldn't understand anyway. I could go on for ages on that, but let me answer some other questions.
Okay. Rasmus, you're next on the list.
Yes, Lord Rees, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. My name is Rasmus Bertelsen. I'm Danish. I'm a political science professor in Norway, did my PhD in Cambridge, and now visiting professor in Paris. You mentioned tax avoidance, and you said that we can't make other countries, how to say, observe tax code or something to that effect. Mm-hmm. And it made me think about, as a professor of international relations, that if we look at tax havens, many tax havens have some kind of crown dependency or relationship to the British Crown. So it's not a question of that we can't make them follow rules. It's a question of that we tolerate it and that we allow it. My guess would be it's because it serves the highest classes of Western society. Yes. Also, what you described about how to say the welfare opportunities of these great advances in productivity. Well, that, of course, is almost exactly what John Maynard Keynes wrote in his famous essay in the interwar years, The Economic Opportunities of Our Grandchildren, right, yes. where Keynes wrote that the gains in productivity was so important that people could have a much more comfortable life.
Yes.
And that, of course, has not happened. And as a professor of political science, I could go a long time about why that's not happened.
Mm-hmm.
But to put on how to say, a very pessimistic outlook. So just like there seems to be a great tolerance of, for example, tax havens,
Mm-hmm.
and that the economic opportunities of our grandchildren that Keynes identified in the 20s were not realized. So what if we put on a very pessimistic outlook, and that just like tax havens are tolerated, that, how to say, biotech tax havens will also be tolerated, and that our grandchildren, so to speak, will not benefit or will not enjoy the economic opportunities that Keynes' grandchildren didn't enjoy either. What happens then?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think it's disgraceful that countries like mine are so tolerant of tax havens, and also it's disgraceful that the tax rates on the wealthy are not higher. It's a real indictment of the world that the 2,000 richest people in the world could double the income there. And what
we've lost you, Tony. Martin.
If I may just jump in again, I think if a lot of us turn off our videos, I think it will improve the quality. I'll turn off my.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
You can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Well, I mean, I think obviously we need to have a massive redistribution of the kind which probably Scandinavian countries are slightly better disposed to than Anglo-Saxon countries. And so we'd have to do that. But I think my answer is I'm extremely pessimistic, because even though you can imagine the financial system being organized in a way which does enable tax collection to be more efficient, I do worry about the empowerment of small dissident groups and crazy individuals by new technology. And for instance, a dangerous bioweapon could be made by a few people in a university lab or an industrial lab. And similarly, cyber attacks can be generated by just a few people, as we know. And I do worry that that is something which you can't regulate any more than the drug laws. And if we want to ensure that we don't have these very dangerous events, then I think there will be a big tension between three things we want to preserve: privacy, security, and freedom. And I think we're going to have to give up a lot of privacy and maybe a lot of freedom if we want to have security. And I think the balance is going to tilt that way, because the consequence of even one person creating a more virulent version of COVID-19 and releasing it or something like that are so serious that it's worth quite a big sacrifice to minimize that risk. And similarly for cyber attacks. So I do think we're going to have very serious problems from the fact that technology in our interconnected world empowers small groups in a way that was not the case until 20 years ago.
Thank you. I hope that answers Rasmus's concerns. We have now Ray Schoenfeld has a question. Do you want to unmute Ray?
I think I've now unmuted. The question is prompted by a comment you made indirectly, I think, about the impact of recent events on support for the Centre for Existential Risk at Cambridge, when you seem to suggest that this has actually increased political awareness of the value of what was being done in Cambridge. And that leads to my question, which is about climate change. In your book on the future, you were relatively pessimistic about the chances of developing optimal, let's call them optimal solutions to climate change because of the powers of entrenched interests. And I'm wondering what you think about that issue today. You mentioned the Magic Four, or some expression like that, the people who were showing some leadership in developing consciousness of all this. Does it make you more optimistic or not?
Well, I'm honestly not very optimistic about a global net zero by 2050, but I do think that the four people I mentioned and all the rest of them are really changing the mindset of business and of politicians. So it is rising higher on the agenda. And some things which can help would be really expanded R&D to actually improve all the various forms of clean energy. And incidentally, I would include fourth generation nuclear in this. I think we're going to need something like that. And if we can have a real expanded program to develop more efficient clean energies, and then not just get to net zero in countries like Britain and France, but help countries like India get to net zero, when, of course, they are going to need an increased amount of energy per capita, whereas we're not. So they have the hardest job. So if the northern countries really have a mega Marshall Plan to help India and Africa to get clean energy and develop, then it's not crazy. So it does really require a change in public attitudes, so that in democracies, politicians can implement a crash program without losing votes. I mean, I quote in my book Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, who said in a different context that politicians, they know what should be done, they don't know how to be re-elected when they've done it. And that's a big problem. And so that's why it's very important to have these charismatic figures who do make the public care about these issues. And because it is a big ask if people are told that they're going to have to pay money for the benefit mainly of people in Africa 30 years in the future.
Thank you.
That's saying that I'm not. It's a big challenge, but I think new technology is the only way we will do it.
Simon Smith has a question, if you would like to unmute.
Yes, thank you. One for, concerning the CSER, Lord Rees.
Yes.
First time I've heard of the body this evening, and as I say, it sounds very interesting. And I was just wondering, giving you a rather open question, what sort of strategies is the centre working on to deal with potential future unpredictable catastrophes? One assumes that you must be coming up with a general purpose policies which would enhance the resilience of the human race when confronted with these events.
Well, what we're trying to do is to bring together experts to think about these scenarios in a deeper way it has been done in the past, because we know, for instance, how unprepared we were in most countries for the present pandemic. It's the lessons we've learned is that it would have been worth spending a great deal more in preparation to be more prepared, and there are all kinds of other scenarios which are unfamiliar but not so improbable. And what we are trying to do is to just explore which are the ones we need to worry about most, and what are the ways in which we can minimize their probability. And the government in the UK is now taking this more seriously, because they have had a risk register which they put out every year or two, and it had an influenza pandemic on it, but it didn't have any other possible pandemic as being anywhere near as serious as influenza. They got that wrong, and cyber attacks are getting more serious, etc. And so there is a change in that. For instance, the House of Lords has set up a special select committee to address these big risks, which I helped to instigate it, and it's having sessions every week with evidence and all that. And I know there are other institutions around the world which are focusing more on the agenda. And the way I put it is, if we focus hugely on small threats like carcinogens in food, traffic accidents and things like that, but these extreme ones where one instance is too many, and where something
Oh, we've lost you, Martin.
Poor connection, I